Thank you for joining us today for our webinar discussing the power of customer data validation and preventing fraud. My name is Ashley McCreary, and I'm a marketing coordinator here at Service Objects, and I'll be helping Rob Manser out throughout the webinar. This webinar should only take about 45 minutes. That does include a Q&A section at the end, but please feel free to write your questions in the chat box below, and we'll make sure we get to them. So here is where I hand it off to Senior Product Marketing Manager, Rob Manser.
Great. Thank you, Ashley, and thanks everyone for joining us today. As Ashley mentioned, today we're going to talk about fraud and how validating your customer data can help fight it. I put together a short agenda, and first we'll talk about what account fraud is and how it impacts a business, and then we'll discuss how to detect that type of fraud and prevent it using what we call customer data validation. And then we'll dive into how customer data validation actually works, and we'll leave some time, as Ashley mentioned, at the end for some questions and answers. But feel free to type in your questions anytime along the way, and we'll just address them all at the end. That way we can just dive in. And so here we go. So where fraud starts. Customer account fraud specifically starts with the customer. Customer accounts are generally created by the customer, usually using manual entry. And that in and of itself comes with the inherent possibility of mistakes, whether it's fat fingering or just an inverse character or whatever. And those are what we call sort of honest mistakes. And those are mistakes we also want to catch and correct if we can. But more to the point for this webinar, that manual entry also creates the opportunity for bad actors to introduce fake data or fraudulent and create fraudulent or fake accounts into your business. And that is the sort of their foothold into doing whatever nefarious business they want to do with you. So we really want to talk about, in the customer data validation part of it, we're going to look at 5 key core identity attributes from our customer. It's going to be their first name, their address, their phone number, their email address, and device or the IP address attached to their device. What do fake accounts do? Well, first of all, they have a negative impact on multiple areas of your business. Not only the financial part of it, but your reputation, and of course, your customer care. In fact, we'll see fake accounts create financial losses. Of course, your reputation gets damaged. It can create some compliance issues, which then turn into legal issues. You'll see marketing and sales performance take a hit from these things. So reaching out to fake accounts is such a waste of sales and marketing resources. And then lastly, it can create some customer care costs, which means it's important that your business implement fraud prevention and detection measures to help identify and remove fake accounts pretty much as soon as possible. It also provides the secondary benefit is it also provides the assurance that the customers that you are engaging with are genuine. So it's a kind of a double win for you. If you can remove the bad and address the good, you're going to be in a great position to identify good quality customers and remove the bad ones. Which kind of brings me to my favorite question, which is, and Ashley's going to post a poll up here, what percentage of your accounts do you think are fake or have inaccurate customer data? Thanks. Well, we're a little bit all over the place. But what I can tell you is that we see on average between 10 and 12% of bad account data. It doesn't always mean it's fraudulent data. It just means that maybe it's not usable, or someone's put in some fake information to get maybe a free marketing tchotchke. Not all of it is fraudulent with nefarious mean or bad intentions behind it. The good news about customer data validation is it can correct a large part of that. But of course, part of that is the bad side of it as well. With that said, I thought we'd take a look at a couple of recent headlines that we've seen where fake accounts have really sort of cost businesses or the government and taxpayers a lot of money. And in the last 20 years of doing this, I will tell you that sadly, these headlines are not out of the ordinary. They're pretty commonplace. They're just the most recent ones. And so I'll quickly dive into maybe 2 examples here. One is JP Morgan in 2021 purchased a company called Frank.com, and they're really there to help facilitate students with getting financial aid. And part of what JP Morgan was interested in when purchasing this company was that they claimed to have had 4.25 million users in their database. And after the acquisition, JP Morgan did a test marketing campaign to that database, and they found that only about 20% of the accounts were legitimate. The other 80% were fake, 100% fake, and to be determined, but allegedly created by the founder specifically to inflate their purchase price with JP Morgan. So it'll be interesting to see play out, but it would have been very easy for us to detect those fake accounts. They were using name, email, phone, and first and last name, email, and phone. And those are definitely 4 data points that we can validate. The second one is during COVID, the California Employment Development Department paid over $20 billion in benefits to fake accounts with fake names like Mr. Poopy Pants or Dianne Feinstein. And the bad actors came from everywhere. This was a very organized and somewhat international attack on the EDD. And there were the random Joes on the street that were making up fake accounts and fake names as well. And both of these could have been easily prevented if we had just looked at the core elements that make up the account: the name, address, phone, email, and device. And we would have been able to, again, the common denominator here is the fake account that they were using to access these. So with that said, how do we prevent these fake accounts from happening? Well, the first thing is to detect them. So you have to detect and prevent. And the answer is very simple. You should be implementing an intelligent, automated customer data validation. The intelligent part is, it's one thing to say a name does or doesn't exist, but you need to be able to cross-validate all that information and come up with an algorithm that helps you understand very quickly in milliseconds if this is a legitimate customer or not. The second part of it is that automated part. That automation, we can't have you looking at hundreds of accounts coming in per day to see if they're valid. You want an algorithm in place that basically will flag those. And so in less than a second, you can verify a customer's name, address, phone, and email address and device against hundreds of trusted authoritative data sources. Our customer data validation service, can be deployed at the point of capture, so right on your forms potentially, if that's where you want to put it, or it can be run periodically on your entire customer data set. And we kind of recommend this as well, because not only does it identify bad data that's in there, but it also ensures that the data that you do have for genuine customers remains up to date and accurate. And each of these core data points that we talk about, the first name, address, phone number, email, and device, they're all individually verified and potentially corrected if needed, as well as cross-validate against one another. And that ensures the accuracy and legitimacy of the customer. And so what I'd like to do is take a deeper look at each of the data points and how we deal with the validation of those. And so let's start with name, because it all starts with the name. Every one of your customers likely has a name captured in your database. And at first blush, you might think that name is an easy thing to fake, but it's actually being done either programmatically or even creatively. There's patterns that are followed that we're able to detect. And so one thing that we're able to determine right away is a name coming from a business or a consumer. And so this is one of those things where if you're a B2B business, you don't want to disqualify Microsoft, which is a terrible first name, but you certainly want to have them as a potential prospect in there, versus if it's a consumer and they put Microsoft in there, you certainly understand that that's not a customer that you're willing to do business or want to do business with. So in addition to that, name validation beyond the business and consumer part of it looks at the syntax of it. Is someone spelling names wrong? Are they using a dictionary to basically create names? Like, are they putting dog, cat as a first and last name? We, of course, can detect if it's vulgar, if it's a nickname. A lot of times people put in celebrity names, or they'll just use bogus names that or garbage names where there's, it's really just hammering the keyboard. And so all of those things are things that name validation can detect and score either positively, negatively, and we'll talk about the scoring a little bit at the end of this because they all come into play. That being said, name validation is one of the first ones that you can use on your form to give you some indication if they're legitimate or not. The second one is address. Now, address provides some key intelligence. It's not just as a good or bad address, but it tells us a lot about location that we'll talk about in a minute. With address validation, we not only check to make sure the address is correct and deliverable, also we'll help with corrections where they're not. So when there's honest mistakes made and you get an address in there, maybe they typed in 132 Main Street and they meant 123 Main Street. We're going to tell you that 132 Main Street doesn't exist and we'll suggest 123 Main Street. And this can help you with legitimate customers and helps head off some of the customer care issues that might come up with incorrect addresses being added. In addition to that, of course, we're going to identify bad addresses and we'll be able to sort of determine if there's a high risk address being added. What we'll see there is incomplete or our address services can then verify and correct addresses for over 250 countries. So it's not just the US or Canada. And we're going to ensure addresses are valid and deliverable, as well as look for the high risk addresses. And in the US specifically, the United States Postal Service looks for very critical delivery details like delivery point validation or RDI, which tells us if it's a residential or consumer delivery point. And so we'll provide those as well. Those also, if it's a bad address, they won't appear. And that'll be a clear indicator that This is an address that the USPS recognizes and therefore should be under scrutiny. Not every address is in the USPS database, but the majority of them are. And if you're just creating them on the fly, you're going to have a hard time creating a legitimate address that comes up with these data points. Internationally, we also validate addresses, and we do those to each country's postal standards. So depending on the sophistication of the postal service of that country, we're able to provide a validation on the address, and then even down to the apartment level. In most developed countries, in the third world countries, it's a little harder for us to do. But all of those, if we get back a good address, tells us that this is probably a genuine address and hopefully a genuine customer. And secondarily, if we get a flag that maybe there's a problem with the address, it's one of the key points that we will look at in assessing the legitimacy of the overall account. Another very powerful data point that we can use is phone numbers. They provide strong clues to fraud. In fact, we access over 4,000 different telecom providers' databases, specifically in the US and Canada alone. And though it's very hard to have a phone number that doesn't have a name and an address attached to it. So if you're going to make up a phone number and we can't either find it or the name and phone number doesn't match the address, it's a clear indicator that the account is probably fraudulent. And so what we find is if the name doesn't match, that may or may not be a problem. But when you start to have the name doesn't match and then the mailing address doesn't match, and then we're looking at a residential or a phone type and it's a business phone and you're supposed to be a consumer or vice versa. And then one of the biggest indicators is the line type. When we look at line type, you'll see that the authentic users are, they're probably wireless or landline. Maybe they're using VoIP. But in fraud, it's very easy to create fake free phone accounts. So are they using a portable VoIP or are they using a disposable phone? Those are things that we can flag and point out to you. And lastly, I'll just point out that we do provide data port, the date that the phone number may have been ported. This may not be a fraud indicator so much, but it helps a lot with some of the telecommunication regulations. There's certain regulations around if and when you can send messaging to a phone number. If it's been ported, you have a window that you can and can't do that within. And so it's not necessarily a fraud tool, but it can help you with compliance as a sort of a secondary benefit. Again, all of these are more flags that we can look for when evaluating the customer to see if they're legitimate. And another one is email. Now, email is, when you look at email, there's like disposable phones and free VoIP accounts, there are disposable and free email accounts like Gmail and Yahoo and Outlook and many, many more. And they're often used by fraudsters because they are free and easy to set up and can be used pretty much anonymously. And so our email validation service performs over 50 integrity checks and filters, and it provides deeper insights into the risk and the deliverability of each email. Again, it's a double benefit. We are going to help you with deliverability of legitimate emails as well as help flag some of the less, let's say, legitimate emails or less legitimate email accounts. But not only does it detect free email accounts, but it also will give you warning flags around bogus or vulgar. Again, kind of like in the name rule where people will make up the front end of the email account and use the back end, like the domain. It might be at gmail.com, but they can write whatever they want on the front end. And a lot of services won't catch that because it could look like a legitimate email based on the domain. But we're going to look for bogus or vulgar in there. We also flag role. So if someone's using like sales at or info at, we're going to flag those as potentially either not necessarily fraudulent, but at least something to look at. It's much easier to use a sales at or create a sales at email for any domain and have it get through a lot of early checks kind of thing. So you want to know that it's a role email. And if you're in marketing and sales, even if you're not looking for fraud, you also want to know that a role email is in your marketing list because those have their own risks and problems with them when you're doing marketing and sales. We also flag Screamer, Honeypot, and Spam Trap emails. And those are largely to help protect your email service providers so that you're not going to get flagged for spam and potentially get blacklisted and stuff like that. So again, not so much for fraud, but it's just an added benefit of using email validation to help protect your sender reputation. And then the next big one is device. And we kind of combine device and IP address because really what we're looking at is the IP address of the device. And this is basically the last of the 5 key data points. And it's really looking for, it's really looking to see if the device or the IP address and the location that it's being used in or registered in, it sort of is in concert with the other data elements that they provided. So IP address has a range of uses, from fraud mitigation to determining location. And sometimes location can be used for targeting marketing campaigns or determining sales territories. We access over 4 billion IP addresses and their reputations. And when we talk about reputations, there is a global community that manages and maintains a list of the IP addresses, and if they're good, bad, nefarious, all that stuff. And so we're part of that organization, and we use those reputations as part of our scoring in evaluating the IP. It's a global IP service, and it will, like I said, determine the location, the device type, and proxy, if they're using a proxy or not. And proxy is important. Proxy servers are used by fraudsters largely to hide their true IP addresses and locations. They're trying to circumvent this lookup that we're trying to do. So if we're not able to legitimately say this IP is in this location, but we know it's a proxy, we're going to flag it as a proxy and say, hey, this deserves a secondary look. There are absolutely legitimate uses for proxy, but it is an indicator. And when you start to cross-compare them with other things, you might see that you might be able to put the puzzle together and see that, oh, there's enough here to give me some warning signs that this isn't a legitimate account. That being said, when we talk about these 5 key elements alone, you can gain real insight into the legitimacy of your customer data. But the real power comes when you cross-validate them against each other. And that's what we've been talking about. And so based on the 5 customer data attributes, we're able to derive over 130 key data points. So from name, address, phone, email, and device, we're able to extrapolate 130 plus key data points. And we're always adding more here. And then we're able to take those data points and cross-validate them across one another. And the result of that is we return actionable scores that can be used to programmatically identify both high-value customers and bad actors. And this helps you prevent them from entering your business platforms from the outset. Or if you wanted to, you could detect them afterwards. Like we talked about, maybe you're reviewing your current customer database that hasn't had this tool in place yet, and helping identify maybe bad actors or high value customers. In addition to that, you can also improve the quality of the contact record. It's important to remember that the customer data validation is not a one size fits all. In fact, we have found many different use cases that require custom validation and scoring. And that leads us to what we call test types, which is, and I won't get too deep into the weeds here, but the devil is in the details here. Your customer validation service needs to perform to your needs, and custom test types allows us to do that. We can basically, it's basically a set of instructions that says, these are the data attributes that we're going to receive into the service. So maybe you're only collecting name, email, and phone, not address and IP for whatever reason. And so we don't want to negatively score the address and IP for you. We want to acknowledge that we're not going to receive that and only score those 3 elements that we do receive. So test types allows us to customize based on your needs, what data attributes are going to be present, what tests are going to be run. And then part of this is what weight you want to give to those tests too. So it might be, if you're a call center, for example, you might collect a name, address, phone number, email, and all those things. But if the most important one in that environment is probably the phone number. So you might want to weight the accuracy and authenticity of a phone number heavier than address and name and email. That being said, there's a lot of configurations. I think we have over 150 custom test types at the moment. And it's likely that we have one that'll fit your need. And if we don't, it's very simple for us to tweak and test one to make one work for your needs. And that is pretty much how customer data validation can help detect fraud and fake accounts on the outset. And it can also help improve the quality of the data that you have, and improve sort of processes down the line for you, whether it's the sales and marketing or to your customer team or even the shipping. That's pretty much the end of the conversation of this. I would like to dive into maybe some questions and answers, see if anybody has any questions.
Yes. So like I said earlier, Please feel free to type in your questions in the chat box below. We do have some coming in. I can read them out to you, Rob. Should I look at the individual scores or the overall score to determine if a lead is bad?
It's a good question. I think you'll find most of my answers are always going to come back to use case. It's really going to come down to how you want to use it. I think the way we generally see it deployed is you use the general or the overall score to kind of divide them into buckets of pass and fail. And the pass fail should be pretty rigid. The pass part of it should be pretty rigid. And the fail part of it isn't fail and get rid of. The fail is fail and review. And then in that fail review, that's where you might pull in, based on your use case, the individual scores. Again, kind of going back to the maybe the call center environment or an e-commerce environment where address is really important. You might then look at the individual scoring for address and say, hey, they got a really high quality score for address. And so we're going to move them back into the pass bucket versus, this is an outright fail across the board. And we're going to programmatically just remove them from our accounts. So it really does come down to use case, but what we recommend is sort of a rigid pass and a soft fail, and then a hard fail for obviously bad accounts, and then a review of those ones that sort of fall in between, using those secondary scores or those individual scores. And sometimes, what we're really trying to get to is a very minimal manual review of accounts, but sometimes some accounts do require a little bit of manual review, but hopefully by automating it all, that number becomes very small.
Great. All right, another one. How frequently do you update the phone numbers in your system?
That's a good question. We have, like I mentioned before, we have about 4,000 in Canada and the US. We have about 4,000 telecom providers for our data. They update their data at their whim. We update our data every 2 weeks. The big providers we update more frequently than that, but the short answer is about every 2 weeks. But not all telecoms update their data every 2 weeks either. So we are a little reliant on them as well. But we're as up to date as every 2 weeks.
Great. For address validation, does the service show who lives at that particular location?
The short answer is no. There's a ton of PI regulations that we are just trying to steer away from here. Our service is to validate the address, not the person who lives at the address. We want to say that this is a legitimate deliverable address. By staying away from the PI information in our services, we really protect our customers, ourselves, and your customers from the PI conversation. That is to be dealt with somewhere else, quite honestly. And so we just avoid the PI part of it by design.
And then how does the customer data validation service impact the user's front end?
Again, it's really up to you as the user how you want to do it. You can implement it right on the front end of the form, and you can alert a customer that there's a problem with maybe a field they've entered. I'm sure you've seen that many times. If you're really focused on the fraud part of it, you might not want to alert anyone unless it's a common error. Maybe there's an email typo or something like that. But you might want to take the more sophisticated problems that arise, or maybe flags that show up for fraud, and you might want to have them show up on your back end. So you're not sort of exposing to the front end how you're checking for fraud. So what we tend to recommend is capture the data, allow the customer to correct things that should be correctable, maybe their phone number, their address, where that that could be problematic. But then in the back end, that's when you're really looking at the scores that come back from the customer's file, and you're using your tools and your business rules to move them around, whether you're passing them, failing them, or hard failing them. But I wouldn't. It's really up to you if you want to have it impact the front end. The good news is it's lightning fast. So if you do want to use it on the front end, it's not going to interrupt. There's not going to be friction there for the form. So hopefully that answers your question.
Yep, definitely. I think that is all the questions that we have right now. Thank you so much for joining us today. There's all the contact information that Rob just displayed on the screen. So thank you once again, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for attending.